Well, good morning. This is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page. Hope everybody's doing well today. It is Tuesday, March 23rd, 2021, and we are going to finish the book of Daniel today. Brian, Linda, Gail, we are all present. Our kids are on spring break this week, so they're watching the live streams, Sarah and Garrett. Lyle, good to see you. All right. So we're going to wrap it up today. The book of Daniel has been, I hope, a good study for you and helped you out. It's helped me out to always go back and look over a book that you haven't studied or taught through in a while. And a lot of interesting things, a lot of beneficial things. We learn a lot of history, world history, even in the book of Daniel. So I hope it's been beneficial for you. As always, if you have any questions or comments about anything, please use the comment section here. Send me a private message. I don't care. If you have a question, I'll do my best to answer it. The plan is we'll finish Daniel today, and then tomorrow at 11 o'clock, we're going to start a study of the book of Romans. The book of Romans. We will be starting that tomorrow. Okay, guys, let's do it. Daniel chapter 12. And the first couple of words clue us in. Let me get my PowerPoint here. All right, the first couple of words clue us in. At that time, Michael shall stand up. Now, this is obviously a continuation of the thought. Michael is mentioned back in chapter 10 and verse 13, and then the last verse of chapter 10, and then throughout chapter 11, of course, we have the vision of those world empires, Persia, Greece, and Rome. So that's the context as we open up here to Daniel chapter 12. There are so many times, and I've said this over the years, and the more and more you study the Bible, you see that these chapter and division breakups sometimes hinder us. We may have a goal in mind. Well, today I'm going to read, let's say you have a Bible study or a Bible reading plan. Let's just say every Monday you read 10 chapters from the Bible, all right? Well, this first Monday, you read the first 10 chapters of something, and then you take a whole week off, and then you start back at chapter 11. We have to remember that just like, okay, we're getting ready to start the book of Romans tomorrow, all right? Paul didn't write Romans chapter 1, verse 1, and then Romans chapter 2 and verse 1. Those chapter and verse divisions came centuries after the original documents were written. So looking at a verse like Daniel 12 and verse 1, I think should help us understand that and should remind us to be careful that we always remember that the Bible is a collection of books, a collection of documents, a collection of letters, a collection of historical accounts even to some extent that are continuous thought. That's really important. So just by way of example, like I said, we're starting Romans chapter 1 tomorrow. We're going to introduce the book and talk about chapter 1, part of it. Romans 1, as we have it in our English Bible, has 32 verses. All right? And then you go from Romans 1:32 to Romans 2 and verse 1, but that's not how Paul wrote it. It's a continued flow. It's a continued thought. One thing leads to the other. And we see that in chapters like this right here with Daniel 12 and verse 1. So look at chapter 11, verse 45. He shall plant the tents of his palace between the sea and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. At that time Michael shall stand up. Remember, the visions, the prophecies of Daniel are bracketed historically from Babylon to Rome. We know that. That's beyond question, and so we have to appreciate that and understand the flow of thought, the continuation of thought from one chapter to the next. This vision that we're going to read here about that we're going to read here in chapter 12 is a continuation of the thought from chapters 10 and 11. So notice this phrase here twice in chapter 1, verse 1. At that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. Well, who's being talked to here? Daniel. This vision is long in the future. Daniel's told that a couple of times, and it affects specifically his people, the Jewish people. There shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time, and at that time your people shall be delivered. So there again, twice in verse 1, we know that the difficulties that are being revealed here to Daniel, that he's going to be dead when they're going on, by the way, they are going to affect, quote, your people, the Jewish people. Throughout chapter 12, at least 3 times, we see this idea of, well, it's first time, verse 4, the time of the end. We see it again in verse 9, the time of the end, refers to the visions of Daniel. Again, remember, what is Daniel chronologically? What is he bracketed by? That from the days of Nebuchadnezzar into Belshazzar, Cyrus, Darius, but then he sees visions that go, to Alexander the Great, the division of Alexander's kingdom, the kingdom that comes after Alexander's kingdom. We have to keep all of that in mind, all right? So we're going to read about these things here in Daniel chapter 12. So notice what it says here in verse 1. There's going to be a time of trouble for his people, and then he says this, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. He's talking about some form of Jewish persecution. And as you pull the continuation from chapter 11 into chapter 12, we know that he's talking about Roman persecution. So I'm going to show you something here just real quick. You go over to Matthew chapter 24, and we have this same language that's used describing the destruction of Jerusalem. Matthew 24, let me get to the right verse here. Turned one too many pages. Matthew 24 and verse 21. In fact, in Matthew 24, when you begin reading in verse 15, Jesus specifically quotes the thing that was spoken by Daniel, the abomination of desolation. But you get down to verse 21 when Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. He says, "For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no nor ever shall be." That's the same language used here in Daniel chapter 12. So that helps us. And the reason this is important is because some people take Daniel chapter 12 and they look even into our future still. The 7 years of tribulation, Jesus reigning on earth for 1,000 years, premillennialism. That's how some people use Daniel chapter 12, and that's not what's going on here. Remember the time frame of Daniel's book. Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar to the Roman Empire, during which time God's kingdom would be established. So that's what we're talking about here in Daniel 12 and verse 1, this difficult time of persecution. But he says, at that time your people shall be delivered. Remember, as Jesus was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem there in Matthew chapter 24, he tells them they can escape. When you see these things, he says, get out of town. The judgment against Jerusalem was a localized judgment, a destruction of the city, a destruction of the temple, because of their constant rejection of the Christ. And that's Matthew chapter 23. He tells them at the end of that chapter, I think it's beginning in verse 37, your house is left unto you desolate. And then he describes that to them, specifically to his disciples, in Matthew 24. We know why it was left desolate, because they rejected the truth, they rejected the Christ, and we know how it was destroyed, and we know when it was destroyed. That's what Daniel 12 is pointing out here. Everyone who is found written in the book of life, and many. So the book of life, this is mentioned here. It's mentioned in Exodus 32. Paul mentions it, I think it's in Philippians chapter 4, those who are written in the book of life. God doesn't literally have a book, all right? He doesn't have a roll book like a teacher in school might have somewhere where he's got names and then I've got to erase this name. This is just language for us to understand that God knows who his people are. All right. 2 Timothy 2:19, the Lord knows those who are his. We want to be in that record. So anyway, this time of difficulty, which Daniel's people would be delivered from, because Jesus told them what to expect and what to do when it happened. He says, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. Notice it says many. It doesn't say all. I've heard a lot of people use Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2 and say, well, this is talking about the final resurrection at the end of time. No, it's not. See, when Jesus comes back one day in the future, all who are in the grave shall hear his voice and come forth. That's what Jesus taught, John chapter 5, verses 28 and 29. That's what Paul taught the Athenians in Acts 17, 30 and 31. God has commanded all men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day in which he will judge the world. This is not a universal resurrection here in Daniel 12 and verse 2. It's not talking about the end of time. It's talking about something that would affect Daniel's people, the Jewish people, verse 1, from which they could be delivered, also verse 1. There would be here's the best way. So let's go ahead and read verse 2. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. When the Roman army surrounded Jerusalem, it woke people up. All right, that's the best way I know to put it. Again, you can read Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, and you can read about this. He told his disciples, you will know when the end of Jerusalem, when it's getting ready to happen, because you're going to see the abomination of desolation that Daniel talked about. They're going to be surrounding the temple. When you see that, get out of town. So what Daniel 12:2 is talking about is that awakening. People would see, oh, here it is. This is what Jesus told us. And again, I've mentioned this throughout the book of Daniel, that it's beneficial to read some things in the writings of Josephus, in the books of the Apocrypha, because they talk about these events. Those who paid attention to what Jesus said there in Matthew 24 about the destruction of Jerusalem and did what he told them to do, survived. They did. There's no question about that. And then you see it here in verse 3. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Any Christian who knew about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 and what would happen escaped. They shined forth. They listened to Jesus, and they escaped that difficult time, that persecution. Let me turn back here real quick to another section of Matthew chapter 24. Pages are sticking. There we go. Matthew 24 verse, let's see. Okay, Matthew 24, notice this, beginning in verse 11. Many false prophets will rise up and deceive many, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. The end of what? The end of the city of Jerusalem. The end of the temple. And that's why the next verse says, therefore when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel, when you see it, you know it's going to happen. All right, so the first 3 verses of Daniel, we understand what he's talking about. The destruction of Jerusalem, not the end of time, not a final resurrection. That's yet in the future, and there are a lot of Bible verses that talk about it. This is not one of them. But you, Daniel, let's go on here. Let me get back to my PowerPoint. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. The time of the end of what? Well, the time of the end of the visions of Daniel, which again are bracketed from Babylon to Rome. That's just the fact of the matter. Okay, I forgot to put that one up there. Time of trouble, many, not all. All right, so we're going to talk about numbers here in just a minute. Sometimes I get talking and I forget to click my buttons over here. The time of the end, many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Well, knowledge of what? Knowledge of the things that Daniel had prophesied about. Jesus spoke about those things. That's the time of the end that he's talking about here. Then I, Daniel, looked, and there stood 2 others, one on this riverbank and the other on that riverbank. Riverbank. What in the world is he talking about? Well, flip back to Daniel chapter 10, and we will know precisely what he's talking about. Daniel chapter 10 and verse 4. Now on the 24th day of the first month, I was by the side of the great river, that is, the Tigris. Remember, Daniel is still in Babylonian captivity. Some Jewish people under Cyrus were allowed to go back to Jerusalem. Daniel was still in Babylon. He's on the Tigris River. That's where he's seeing this vision. Now he sees some people with him on this riverbank. And one said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long shall the fulfillment of these wonders be? Now we're getting ready. I put it up here on the screen already to talk about some numbers. Remember, Daniel is very similar in parts of Daniel are very similar to some things that we read in the book of Revelation. Symbolism, signs. Let's see, verse 7. Then I heard the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time. 3.5, all right, a time, and then multiple times, and then half a time. 3.5. And when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, and all these things shall be fulfilled. All these what things? All these visions that Daniel's had. The vision that he's currently having that's being explained to him by an angel. 3.5 is not literally 3.5 years or 3.5 months or anything like that. It's symbolic, just like the numbers again, and the signs, and the beasts, and all these things that we've read, they are symbolic. Helping Daniel understand that it's many days. That's one thing that we've read. These visions are many days in the future that Daniel's privileged to see here. That's what 3.5 is talking about. It will come to an end at a point in time in the future. Daniel's going to be dead when these things are fulfilled, by the way. The last verse here tells us that. That's when these things shall be finished. The power of the holy people has been completely shattered. Again, you go back to verse 1. These visions affect Daniel's people, the Jewish people. When that temple was destroyed, that affected a lot of people, the Jewish nation specifically, the city of Jerusalem specifically, because the Jews had this very limited idea of God, and we see this even in the Old Testament. They believed that Jehovah, the God of heaven, they felt that he lived in the temple. Well, they were wrong. And Solomon even got that. You go back to, I think it's 1 Kings 8, maybe verse 46. When they were dedicating the temple, Solomon's temple, after it had been completed, Solomon said, "Heaven of heavens cannot contain thee. How much more this house that I have built?" God did not live in the temple in Jerusalem. That's just a silly idea. But this is where he would meet them at the altar, meet the high priest once a year. So, their reliance on that physical structure was going to be completely shattered when it was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. All right, that's what this is talking about. Verse 8, "Although I heard, I did not understand. Then he said, My Lord, what shall be the end? Then I said, My Lord, what shall be the end of these things? Go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end." Again, Daniel's not going to live to see what's being prophesied here. See that in verse 13. But here's what's going to happen. Verse 10, "Many shall be purified, made white and refined, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand." Think about that phrase there. The wise shall understand. And then connect it with what Jesus said. "He who hears these sayings of mine and does them, I shall liken him unto a wise man who built his house upon a rock." Matthew 7, was that beginning in verse 24 or so? Jesus warned people in his day about the destruction of Jerusalem, and they were wise if they paid attention, because he told them, when you see the Roman armies surround the temple, get out of town. That's what this vision's about here. Very easy to understand in that sense, okay? Verse 11, "And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days." So here again we have numbers, and it's so interesting to read these guys who think they know what the numbers mean, but they all disagree, and they all say they know what it means, that it's some literal number, and they all disagree, and yet they're all dogmatic on their disagreement. To me, the way people handle apocalyptic literature like this, symbolic literature like this, is kind of amusing, because they think they know it all. They know precisely what these visions mean, when Daniel himself says, what does this mean? And then he's told, well, you got 1,290 days, and then 1,335 days. These numbers are symbolic for long periods of time. We know, generally, Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, to a fourth kingdom, to a fourth empire, during which time God's kingdom would be established. And these things, Daniel, they're going to affect your people, but they're for a long time in the future, and you'll be dead when all this happens. There are many things that we can know, that we can apply, but the fact of the matter is, to try to pin down this 3.5 and this verse 11, this 1,290, and verse 12, the 1,335. You can't do it. You can't do it. But you, verse 13, go your way till the end, for you shall rest and will arise to your inheritance at the end of the days. Daniel would not live to see the fulfillment, but he would be rewarded for his faithfulness. We know that. And I have a typo there. Daniel would not love to see the fulfillment. Well, I guess that's kind of true because they were very troubling. He would not love to see what was going to happen to his people because they were going to go through a lot of difficulties. And contextually in his day, in Daniel's day, they were going through a lot of difficulties. Not only had they spent 70 years in Babylonian captivity, but once they returned to Jerusalem, they had trouble from the locals of that area. They'd been gone for 70 years. People had re-inhabited Judea and Jerusalem. And when they go back under the decree of Cyrus to rebuild the temple and the city, they had persecution. They had persecution during, throughout what we call the intertestament period. That's what we looked at through Daniel chapter 11. So he would not love to see the fulfillment of these visions, but that's not what I had intended to type. All right, guys, that is the book of Daniel. A very unique book, a lot to learn, very valuable. If you got any questions or comments, use the question and comment there. Use the comment section and ask your question there. Yeah, David, exactly. This section is a premillennial playground. But here's the thing. David's exactly right. And I mentioned it in passing, but here's the thing. Premillennialism looks to a future even for us and says there's going to be a rapture, there's going to be a 7-year period of tribulation, and there's going to be 1,000 years of Christ on earth. I mean, I understand that's a very oversimplified description of premillennialism, but that's essentially what we're dealing with here. But Daniel, again, when you look at the brackets, if you will, of Daniel, it's always from Babylon to Rome. So if premillennialism is true, that David brought up here, if premillennialism is true, then we're going to have to reestablish Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. We're going to have to go through it all again and have God's kingdom established again, and then all that other stuff happen. It just makes no sense. What people do with the Bible is a terrible thing. They come to it with their preconceived notions, and then every passage they look at, they see what they already believe. So we're going to start, so that'll kind of launch into this. We're going to start Romans tomorrow. It's interesting when you read commentaries on Romans, everybody's trying to figure out, here's this theme. All right, here's one verse that summarizes the entire book and what it's all about. Well, sometimes that is the case. Like John's gospel, we're told very specifically at the end why John wrote the things that he wrote, why he wrote the style in which he wrote. Think about this. When the church in Rome got that letter from Paul, do you think they sat down and searched for one or two phrases throughout that whole document and said, oh, that's why he wrote? That's the purpose of this? No. They read it as a letter that he wrote to them, and he covers all kinds of topics. So I think we can harm our own, I guess I would say our own understanding of the Bible by trying to pigeonhole books or pigeonhole a certain passage and say, well, this is the theme of the whole book. We need to be very careful about that. And I understand the Bible is a collection of 66 books that they all really do have a central theme. It's ultimately all about Christ and God's purpose in Christ throughout all eternity. And while that is true and demonstrable, it's also true that each book, all right, like Daniel, like Romans, had a very specific purpose, had a very specific audience. So we need to understand that. And we're going to do our best to approach the book of Romans that way starting tomorrow. Yeah, Aaron says it can harm our own interpretation and understanding of it. Absolutely true. Okay, guys, that is all for today. I appreciate you being here. Hope you'll be back tomorrow, 11 o'clock. We're going to start studying the book of Romans. Do a little introductory work, the date, that kind of stuff. Talk about that tomorrow. And, well, I guess that's it. Hope you all have a good day. and hope to see you back here tomorrow.